Jake Harper, 42, had always been the kind of man people could rely on. As a truck driver for nearly 2 decades, he had been there through countless long-haul nights, navigating icy roads, blinding rain, and the endless monotony of highways that stretched into oblivion. Despite leaving the rig for a few years to try his hand at warehouse logistics, Jake had returned to trucking, finding strange comfort in the steady rhythm of the life he knew best. Anna Harper, 39, knew all too well the cost of Jake's heroism. She had spent years waiting for the phone to ring with good news or bad, waiting for Jake to come home from long shifts, and now, waiting for him to notice the growing distance between them. Her days felt like a series of half-finished thoughts and unspoken words, filling the gaps with volunteer work at the community center and long walks along Fairhaven's cobblestone streets. But the loneliness clung to her, a shadow that even the golden Oregon sunlight couldn't chase away. Their 16-year-old daughter was sensitive and imaginative, always a dreamer with a voice that turned heads at every school talent show. But as the years passed, she seemed to drift further into herself, a quiet rebellion against the perfection that the Harper family was expected to embody. In early November, she joined the church choir without telling her parents, drawn to the way the music filled the space of the cave, making her feel small but important. The hymns felt like a secret language she could speak fluently when words failed her elsewhere. It was at St. Joseph's that the Harper family's carefully constructed facade began to crack. Reverend Elias Green, 33, had arrived in Fairhaven on September 15, 2020, stepping into a role left vacant by the passing of the town's previous priest, Father Matthias, in June of the same year. Young, charismatic, and endlessly approachable, Reverend Green quickly became a figurehead in the community. His sermons were unlike anything the parishioners had ever heard, less about dogma and more about empathy, kindness, and the complexities of human connection. Anna first met Reverend Green on December 17, 2020, after one of Sophie's choir performances. It was a chance encounter. She had come to support her daughter and stayed to help clean up after the event. Green had a way of speaking that made her feel heard, even when she wasn't saying much at all. "You're Sophie's mother," he'd said warmly, his kind eyes meeting hers. "You must be proud." "I am," Anna replied, though she felt a pang of guilt, realizing how little she truly knew about her daughter's world. It started innocently. They discussed Sophie's choir performances, the church's charitable initiatives, and Anna's volunteer work. But gradually, the conversations turned personal. Anna opened up about her frustrations with Jake, her feelings of isolation, and the growing void in her life. Elias listened intently, his eyes never straying from hers, and offered words that felt like balm to her wounded spirit. "Anna," he said one evening in his office, the faint scent of incense lingering in the air. "You deserve to feel appreciated. To feel cherished." Elias leaned forward, his voice soft yet firm. "You are extraordinary, Anna. Never forget that." It was then that he took her hand. The touch was fleeting, but it lingered in Anna's thoughts. She knew it was wrong, but it filled a void she couldn't ignore. Sophie had started noticing the changes in her mother. Anna, once attentive to every detail of their lives, was distracted. Her usual evening routines, family dinners, checking Sophie's homework, had been replaced by excuses to visit the church or stay late after events. The following week, Sophie stayed late after choir practice to rehearse a solo for an upcoming performance. The church was quiet, the kind of silence that amplified every sound. She was alone in the nave, her voice echoing softly as she sang. After finishing, she wandered toward the vestry to grab her coat, but stopped short when she heard voices. "Anna, you have no idea how much you mean to me," Elias said, his voice low and intimate. Sophie froze, her heart pounding. "I don't know what I'd do without you," Anna replied, her voice trembling slightly. Through the small gap in the door, Sophie saw them standing close, too close. And then it happened. Elias leaned in, and Anna met him halfway. Their embrace was unmistakably intimate. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She stumbled backward, the sound of her footsteps echoing briefly in the hallway. Panic gripped her as she fled the church, her mind racing. That night, Sophie lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her mind replayed the scene over and over, each detail sharper than the last. How could her mother betray their family? How could Reverend Green, someone she trusted and admired, do this? The next morning, Anna noticed Sophie's unusually quiet demeanor. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" Anna asked as she poured Sophie a glass of orange juice. Sophie hesitated, her hands tightening around the edge of the table. "I'm fine," she said, her voice clipped. Anna frowned but didn't press. The next day, Elias was watching the surveillance footage and noticed that Sophia had spotted him and Anna last night. Elias tensed up. "This little girl could reveal our secret, we need to deal with it," he muttered to himself. On the evening of March 5, Sophie walked into St. Joseph's Church, her heart pounding with a mixture of anger and unease. Reverend Elias Green had approached her after choir practice that afternoon, his voice calm but insistent. "Sophie," he said, his eyes locking onto hers, "I can tell something is troubling you. We need to talk. Meet me at the church tonight, and we can clear this up." The request left her conflicted, but her need for answers outweighed her apprehension. When she arrived, the sanctuary was cloaked in an eerie stillness. The usual warmth of the stained glass windows was absent, their beauty muted by the darkness outside. Flickering candlelight cast wavering shadows across the rows of pews and the polished altar. Elias stood near the pulpit, his hands clasped in front of him. His expression was calm, almost fatherly, but there was an edge of tension in his posture that Sophie couldn't ignore. "Thank you for coming," he said softly, gesturing for her to sit in one of the front pews. "I'd rather stand," Sophie replied, her voice sharp. She crossed her arms, keeping her distance. Elias sighed but nodded. "Very well. Sophie, I know you've been upset about some things you've seen. I want to explain." She glared at him. "Explain what?" "That you've been sneaking around with my mom. That you've been lying to my dad, and to everyone else who trusts you." "That's not fair," Elias said, his tone steady but defensive. "Your mother is struggling. She needed someone to talk to, someone to support her. That's all I've been doing." Sophie scoffed. "Support her? You think I haven't seen the way you look at each other? You're not helping her, you're betraying my dad." "Sophie," Elias said, stepping closer, his voice softening. "You're young. You don't understand the complexities of adult relationships. It's not as simple as you think." "I understand enough to know this is wrong," Sophie snapped. "I plan to tell my dad everything." Sophie lied, she had actually already written her dad a message about the news, but because he was far away, he wouldn't arrive until a few days later. Panic flashed across Elias's face. "Wait, Sophie, please. Just listen." But Sophie had heard enough. She turned abruptly and moved toward the main doors, her steps quick and determined. "Sophie, stop." Elias called after her, his voice echoing through the sanctuary. She didn't stop. In her haste, Sophie didn't notice the edge of a thick carpet near the center aisle. Her foot caught on the uneven fabric, and she stumbled forward. Before she could regain her balance, she collided with the corner of a heavy wooden pew. The impact was brutal. Her head struck the sharp edge with a sickening crack, and she crumpled to the floor, motionless. "Sophie," he murmured, his voice trembling as if hoping she would stir, that this nightmare wasn't real. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Her expression was frozen in a tragic mix of fear and defiance. The sight brought tears to his eyes, tears of panic, regret, and desperation. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he whispered to himself, his voice cracking. "It was an accident. She tripped. It wasn't my fault." But deep down, Elias knew no one would see it that way. Sophie's words echoed in his mind, I plan to tell my dad everything. Her accusations, her threat to expose him, they were the perfect storm that would bury him under a tidal wave of scandal and condemnation. A priest tangled in a web of lies, already under suspicion for an inappropriate relationship with a married woman, now found with the dead body of her daughter. No explanation would absolve him. His hands shook as he touched his clerical collar, the symbol of his faith and authority. He had once taken solace in its weight, but now it felt like a noose tightening around his neck. Time seemed to stand still, every passing second amplifying the deafening silence. He forced himself to act, his movements mechanical as his mind raced. He couldn't leave her here. Someone would find her, and the questions would begin. Why was she here at night? What happened? No one would believe the truth, that it had been a tragic accident born out of her anger and his desperation to explain. Elias glanced toward the altar, then at the grand double doors of the church. His instincts screamed at him to run, to leave Fairhaven and disappear forever. But the thought of fleeing was quickly replaced by another, hide the body. If no one finds her, there will be no questions, Swallowing the bile rising in his throat, Elias bent down and carefully lifted Sophie's lifeless body into his arms. She felt heavier than he expected, her weight compounded by the unbearable guilt pressing on his chest. As he carried her, his eyes darted toward the doors, half expecting someone to burst in and catch him in the act. The basement. It was the only place he could think of. The church's basement was a labyrinth of forgotten corners and disused storage spaces, a place few ever ventured into. He had stored choir robes and old hymnals there over the years, but most of it was cluttered with items left untouched for decades. If he could find a secluded spot, it would buy him time to figure out his next move. Elias descended the narrow stone staircase leading to the basement, his steps careful but urgent. The air grew colder as he went deeper, the faint smell of damp stone mingling with the metallic tang of fear that clung to him. His heart pounded as he reached the bottom, his eyes scanning the dimly lit space. Rows of wooden shelves lined the walls, covered in a thin layer of dust. Candles flickered weakly, their light barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. In the farthest corner of the basement, hidden behind a stack of old crates, Elias spotted a small alcove. It had been sealed off at some point in the past, but the wooden panel covering it had come loose over the years. He pushed aside the crates with trembling hands, revealing the dark, hollow space behind the panel. "This will have to do," he muttered under his breath, his voice shaky. With a deep, shuddering breath, Elias laid Sophie's body in the alcove. He arranged her gently, his hands lingering for a moment as he struggled to accept what he was doing. Her pale face seemed to accuse him, her lifeless eyes staring through him. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, tears streaming down his cheeks. He clasped his hands together and muttered a desperate prayer. "Lord, forgive me. Please, forgive me." But the words felt hollow, his connection to the divine severed by the enormity of his actions. He knew forgiveness was not something he could ask for, not now, not after this. He stepped back and replaced the wooden panel, pressing it firmly into place. The alcove disappeared from view, hidden once more behind the stack of crates. Elias wiped his hands on his robe, his palms slick with sweat. His heart raced as he turned and ascended the stairs, each step feeling like a march toward an uncertain doom. Back in the sanctuary, Elias paused at the altar. The flickering candles cast his shadow across the walls, a distorted reflection of the man he had become. He felt the weight of his choices, the crushing realization that there was no turning back. He extinguished the candles one by one, plunging the church into darkness. As the light faded, so did the last remnants of his hope. He knew that hiding Sophie's body was only a temporary solution. The truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it was buried. Elias exited the church, locking the heavy doors behind him. The cold night air hit him like a slap, and for a moment, he stood on the steps, staring out into the quiet streets of Fairhaven. The town he had once served as a spiritual leader now felt alien, its people unknowingly harboring a man who had crossed a line he could never uncross. As he walked away from the church, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that Sophie's ghost would haunt him forever. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind, would remind him of her final moments and the irreversible choices he had made. Though he had hidden the evidence, Elias knew that his soul could not hide from the weight of his guilt. The question wasn't if the truth would come out, but when, and what would happen when it did. The next morning, Elias stood at the church doors, greeting parishioners as if nothing had happened. When Anna arrived, her face clouded with worry, he greeted her with practiced concern. "Anna," he said gently, pulling her aside. "Is Sophie all right? She seemed upset the last time I saw her." Anna frowned. "She didn't come home last night. I thought she might have stayed with a friend, but no one's heard from her." Elias placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Perhaps she needed some time alone. Teenage stress can be overwhelming." Anna nodded, though her worry deepened. "I'll call around again," she said. "You let me know if there's anything I can do to help," Elias replied, his voice filled with false sympathy. "Missing, Sophie Harper," the flyers read. "Last seen March 8th. Please call with any information." Anna Harper was shattered. She clung to Elias Green for comfort, believing his gentle reassurances that Sophie had likely run away due to the family stress. On the evening of March 7th, the tension in Anna's home was almost tangible. Anna and Reverend Elias Green sat on the worn sofa, their embrace intimate and their shared whispers carrying the weight of secrets. Candles flickered on the coffee table. Their kiss deepened, though Anna's movements were hesitant, her mind clouded with guilt. Elias, however, held her tightly, whispering soothing reassurances that only added to her inner turmoil. Suddenly, the sound of the front door slamming broke the quiet. Anna shot upright, her eyes wide in panic as her husband, Jake Harper, stepped into the living room. "What the hell is this?" Jake bellowed, his voice echoing through the small house. His eyes locked on the priest, who sat frozen, guilt and fear written plainly across his face. "Jake, it's not what it looks like," Anna stammered, quickly distancing herself from Elias. Jake's face twisted with rage, and his gaze darted between his wife and the man he had once respected as a community leader. "Not what it looks like. My daughter is missing, Anna. And this is how you spend your time? With him?" "Jake, please, let me explain," Anna began, but Jake was already moving. "You don't need to explain a damn thing," he growled, his focus now entirely on Elias. "Get out of my house before I throw you out myself." Elias stood, trying to maintain his composure. "Jake, calm down. This isn't helping anyone. Don't you dare tell me to calm down." Jake roared, lunging at him. The two men collided, Jake's fists swinging as Elias struggled to block the blows. Anna screamed, her hands flying to her mouth as she watched in horror. "Jake, stop," she cried, but her voice was drowned out by the sound of their struggle. Desperate to intervene, Anna's gaze fell on the wine bottle lying on the carpet. Her hands trembled as she grabbed it, her mind racing with fear. "Stop it, Jake. You're going to hurt him," she yelled, but Jake didn't relent. In her panic, Anna raised the bottle and swung it with all her strength. The glass shattered against Jake's head with a sickening crack. His body went limp, and he crumpled to the floor. "Jake!" Anna gasped, dropping the broken bottle and rushing to her husband's side. Blood trickled from a shallow gash on his temple, staining the carpet beneath him. "Oh my God, what have I done?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Anna," Elias said firmly, "we don't have time to panic. If he wakes up and remembers what happened, he'll call the police. Think about Sophie. Think about what this will do to her when she's found. We need to handle this carefully." In order not to waste time, Anna quickly packed the most necessary things into her handbag, and together with Elias she ran to his house. Elias Green's small house was a modest and unassuming structure tucked away at the edge of Fairhaven. Anna Harper sat on the sofa in the living room, her tear-streaked face buried in her hands. The events of the previous night weighed on her like a crushing boulder. She had left her unconscious husband bleeding on the living room couch. She had fled with Elias, the man she had thought she could trust. And now, in the dim morning light filtering through the curtains, everything seemed surreal. Elias paced the kitchen, his movements erratic. "We need to keep calm," he muttered, though his voice trembled with unease. "No one saw us leave your house. We just need to figure out our next steps." Anna looked up, her face pale and hollow. "Next steps," she whispered. "What next steps?" "Jake will wake up, and he'll tell the police everything. And Sophie, oh, God, where is Sophie?" Her voice cracked, and tears streamed down her face again. Elias knelt beside her, his hands gripping hers tightly. "Anna, listen to me. Everything will be fine. Sophie will come home. We'll figure this out together. You have to trust me." While Anna and Elias were hiding, the church cleaner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Delaney, arrived as usual on Sunday morning. She was going to do some tidying up around the church grounds before the congregation arrived. So she went down to the basement to get supplies. As soon as she opened it, the strong smell made her dizzy. She followed the smell, walking cautiously, until she reached the far corner of the basement, where she almost never looked. With trembling hands, she pushed aside the board and gasped. There, hidden in the alcove, was the lifeless body of Sophie Harper. Mrs. Delaney stumbled backward, her face pale and her breath hitching in her throat. She fumbled for her phone and dialed the police, her voice shaking as she explained what she had found. When she hung up, her thoughts immediately turned to Anna, who was a friend and fellow member of the church. Mrs. Delaney hesitated only briefly before dialing Anna's number. Anna's phone buzzed on the table, the sound cutting through the tense silence of the kitchen. She snatched it up, her heart pounding as she saw Mrs. Delaney's name on the screen. "Mrs. Delaney?" Anna answered, her voice shaky. "Anna," Mrs. Delaney said, her voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how to tell you this, but they found Sophie. At the church." Anna's heart stopped. "Sophie? Is she okay?" Mrs. Delaney's sob broke through the line. "No, Anna, she's gone. I found her body in the church basement. I'm so sorry." The phone slipped from Anna's hand and clattered onto the table. She stared at it, unseeing, as the words sank in. Her daughter was dead. The anguish that tore through her was unlike anything she had ever felt. She let out a guttural cry, her hands clutching her chest as if trying to hold her heart together. Tears streamed down her face, but the grief quickly twisted into something darker. Her mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the last few days. Sophie had been missing since the night she argued with Elias. Elias had been calm, too calm, when he reassured her Sophie would come home. And now Sophie was dead, her body hidden at the church, a place Elias knew intimately. Anna's hands trembled as she stood. Her gaze fell on the gun she had grabbed from Jake's things before fleeing their home. Her breathing grew ragged, and a fiery determination burned in her chest. Elias, who had been sitting at the table, looked up as she approached. "Anna? What's wrong? Who was on the phone?" "You," she hissed, her voice shaking with fury. "You killed my daughter." Elias's eyes widened. "Anna, no. You've got it wrong. Don't lie to me," she screamed, the gun trembling in her hands. "I trusted you, and you killed her. You hid her body, didn't you? All this time, you've been lying to me." Elias stood, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Anna, listen to me. It was an accident. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." His words only fueled her rage. "She was my daughter." The shot rang out, shattering the silence. Elias staggered backward, clutching his chest, and collapsed onto the floor. Anna dropped the gun, her chest heaving as she stared at his lifeless body. Her ears rang, and the world blurred around her. The neighbors, alarmed by the gunshot, quickly called the police. Within minutes, sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder until they stopped outside Elias's house. Officers stormed in, guns drew standing in the kitchen, dazed and trembling. The officers secured the scene and escorted Anna out in handcuffs. She didn't resist, her mind numb as she replayed the moment over and over. At the station, Anna confessed to shooting Elias, explaining through sobs what she had learned about Sophie and her growing suspicion that Elias was responsible. The police, now aware of Sophie's death, began piecing together the tragic puzzle. Jake Harper woke on the living room couch with a splitting headache and dried blood crusted to his temple. The events of the previous night came flooding back, finding Anna with Elias, the fight, and the blow to his head. But as he called out for Anna and Sophie, the silence in the house felt deafening. It didn't take long for him to learn what had happened. His daughter was dead, his wife was in jail, and the priest he had trusted was gone. Jake stayed in the house, the memories of his family haunting every corner. He devoted himself to honoring Sophie's memory, setting up a small shrine with her photos and belongings in the living room. Though his life was irreparably shattered, he vowed to keep her spirit alive in whatever way he could. As the town whispered about the tragedy, Jake remained a stoic figure, a grieving father in a home that had become both a sanctuary and a reminder of everything he had lost.